end of the telephone line was a modest and welcoming voice. The family consisted of two survivors, Ibi and her son Andy, whose love for each other eclipsed any solely academic interest I might once have had in the genre of the memoir, the period of the war in Budapest and its environs, and the narration of two memoirs of the Holocaust. With Ibi's encouragement, I came to understand my need to try to make sense of the crime of the rapid decimation of Hungary's Jews and Roma, and I reflected on what has become a method of understanding now. The act of retracing steps, in this case Ibi's and Andy's, through the Jewish quarter of Budapest, the former ghetto area in Pest, and eventually the house in which they were forced to live in the Budapest ghetto until they were liberated by Soviet forces in the yard at Akacfa, or Acacia Street. In other words, it was my own romantic view of Hungary as homeland that was challenged, and as I struggled to speak my father's first language, Ibi and Andy aimed only to speak mine. In the long aftermath of World War II, Europe's economic losses worsened. Pre-war populations suffered great civilian losses, enormous military casualties, the bombardment of grand cities, the distinctive Danube bridges and multiform architecture from Gothic to Art Nouveau, Roman to Bauhaus, and Turkish styles to an array of synagogue architectures, and the continuing tragic devastation of Europe's Jewish population in real numbers and enforced migrations abroad. Nowhere were these losses more palpable than in Hungary and, tragically, in the absolute final stages of the war. There, not only had the majority of Hungarian Jewry been murdered, but also its smaller Roma population, murdered in the gypsy family camps or scattered across Europe. Hungary was an independent ally of Nazi Germany until March 19, 1944, the day Germany occupied Hungary. On April 5th, Jews were forced to wear the yellow star. 1 month later, in May, mass deportations began. Between May 15th and July 9th, 1944, 437,402 Jews were deported from Hungary. The Canadian survivor, Rudolf Verba, born in Slovakia, co-author of the renowned Verba-Wetzler report, attested to the organization of the murder of the Hungarians who would be arriving in Auschwitz from Hungary in 1944, a selection that did not, by chance, include Ibi and Andy. Verba affirms that fewer than 5% of the Hungarian deportees returned. Prior to the deportations, approximately 825,000 Jews lived in Hungary. According to the 1941 census, 200,000 of these resided in Budapest proper. The Jews in Budapest were not subjected to the same en masse deportations as those residing throughout the rest of the country. They were, instead, harassed and restricted by several anti-Jewish laws, and in October 1944, at the mercy of a new fascist regime led by the Aerocross Party, Jews were increasingly rounded up, assaulted, and murdered. On October 15, 1944, Hungary's regent, Admiral Miklós Horthy, had announced that Hungary was not going to war and that nobody had to worry. Ibi thought this meant she could tear the yellow star off her chest. But later that day, Ferenc Szálasi and the Aerocross Party took over the government, intent on collaborating with the Nazis and murdering the Jewish population who remained in Budapest. In November 1944, Ibi and Andy were among thousands incarcerated in the Budapest ghetto. But they held on long enough that they were saved from deportation and death, protected by the Russians who freed them, and then by the Allies who followed close on the Russians' heels. Ibolya Grossman was an ordinary woman who lived through extraordinary times with grace, verve, and joyfulness whenever possible. This she did without ignoring the past, her past, and a life that included the death of her loved ones, especially Zoltán, her husband, and the father of her only child, Andy Reti. My pressing curiosity about Andy Reti and his beloved mother, Ibi, actually began in a symbolic reading of the writing of Andy's absent father.